At 15 years old, he stood in a shield wall, soaked in blood, watching his king and half-brother cut down beside him. Within hours, he was wounded, on the run, and an outlaw in his own homeland. Within 20 years, he would command the emperor's elite guard in Constantinople, burn rebels in Bulgaria, rule Norway, and die trying to take the throne of England. This is the story of Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, the last great Viking king whose death helped end the Viking Age. Harald Sigurdsson was born around the year 1015 in Norway. His half-brother was Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, king of Norway and a Christianizing ruler trying to centralize power. In 1030, when Harald was about 15, he joined Olaf at the Battle of Stiklestad. Olaf was trying to regain the Norwegian throne after being forced out by a coalition of local chieftains and the Danish king, Canute the Great. The battle was a disaster. Olaf was killed. Harald was badly wounded. The opposition victory meant Canute's control over Norway was secured. Harald was now on the losing side of a failed rebellion. Staying in Norway was suicide. So he fled east, over the mountains into Sweden, and then further into Kievan Rus, the powerful realm centered on Kiev and Novgorod. In Kievan Rus, he served under Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Many Scandinavians did the same, acting as warriors and bodyguards. Harald likely gained his first experience as a commander here, but the real opportunity lay even further south. By the mid-1030s, Harald and several hundred followers traveled to Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. There, Norse and Rus warriors joined the emperor's elite mercenary corps, the Varangian Guard. Harald entered service under the Byzantine emperor. The exact year is debated, but it was likely in the mid-1030s. Over roughly a decade, Harald fought in multiple imperial campaigns. He took part in operations in the Mediterranean, including campaigns in southern Italy and Sicily, where the Byzantines were trying to claw back territory from Muslim and Norman forces. He fought in the Balkans during a major revolt in Bulgaria. Later saga sources claim he earned the nickname Bulgara Brenir, Bulgar Burner, for his harsh suppression of rebels there. Modern historians treat the details cautiously because most specifics come from much later Icelandic sagas, but it is clear he fought in the Balkans and distinguished himself. By the early 1040s, Harald had risen to a high rank within the Varangian Guard and amassed great wealth, gold, silk, and portable treasure that he sent back north for safekeeping. But Constantinople was never meant to be his final stop. After disputes with imperial authorities and possibly a period of imprisonment, again the exact story depends heavily on much later saga accounts, Harald left Byzantine service. By the mid-1040s, he was heading back toward Scandinavia, no longer just an exiled teenager, but a battle-hardened commander with years of experience in some of the most sophisticated armies in the world. Harald returned to Kievan Rus, then moved on to Scandinavia, aiming for the Norwegian throne that his half-brother Olaf had died trying to reclaim. At this point, Norway was ruled by Magnus the Good, Olaf's son, Harald's nephew. Instead of plunging straight into civil war, Harald struck a deal. In 1046, Harald and Magnus agreed to rule Norway jointly. Harald brought money, battle experience, and support from warriors who'd served with him abroad. Magnus brought legitimacy as the reigning king and son of a saint. The arrangement didn't last long. In 1047, Magnus died unexpectedly. With his death, Harald became sole king of Norway. This is when he truly earns his later nickname, Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. Harald's rule was strong, centralized, and sometimes ruthless. He pushed hard to increase royal control over resources and trade. He clashed with local chieftains and landowners who resented his taxation and authority. Saga traditions describe him as harsh with opponents and not overly patient with dissent. But Harald wasn't content with just Norway. He believed he had a claim to the Danish throne as well, following the complicated succession after Canute the Great. Denmark was then ruled by Svein Estridsson. From about 1048 until the early 1060s, Harald launched repeated campaigns against Denmark, raiding its coasts and fighting naval battles in an attempt to force his claim. One of the most important engagements was the naval battle of Nisa, fought in 1062. According to sources, Harald assembled a large fleet and met Sweyn's forces off the Norwegian coast. The battle was fierce and bloody, with heavy casualties on both sides. Harald is described as using disciplined ship formations and heavy missile fire, showing the influence of his experience in Byzantine and Rus warfare. Harald's forces won the battle, but the victory was incomplete. Sweyn escaped with survivors, and crucially, Harald did not gain control of Denmark. After years of stalemate, by around 1064 to 1065, Harald and Sweyn agreed to a peace. Harald abandoned his Danish ambitions in exchange for stability and recognition of his rule over Norway. By now, Harald was in his early 50s, which for a Viking Age warrior is already remarkable. He'd fought in Norway, Rus, Byzantium, the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and across the North Sea. But his most famous and final campaign was still ahead of him. In early 1066, the King of England, Edward the Confessor, died without a direct heir. Several powerful men claimed the throne. Harold Godwinson, the leading English noble, was crowned king. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne, and Harald Hardrada of Norway also put himself forward as a contender. Harold's claim was based on an earlier agreement. King Harthacnut of Denmark and England had reportedly made a pact with Magnus the Good that whoever outlived the other would inherit both realms. When Magnus died, Harald believed he had inherited that claim. Whether this claim was strong or not in the eyes of the English is another matter, but for Harald, it was enough justification for war. He struck an alliance with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the English King Harold. Tostig knew the English coast and its politics and promised support for an invasion. In late summer 1066, Harald sailed from Norway with a large fleet. Contemporary sources suggest around 300 ships. Even if that number includes smaller support vessels, it was a major expedition. They landed in northern England, near the River Humber, and advanced inland. On the 20th of September 1066, at the Battle of Fulford, Harald and Tostig met an English army near York, commanded by Earls Edwin and Morcar. Harold's forces won. The English Earl's army was defeated, and York surrendered shortly after. Harold's invasion seemed to be going well. But King Harold Godwinson moved with terrifying speed. After being crowned in January 1066, Harold had been waiting in the south for William of Normandy. When he heard of Harald Hardrada's landing in the north, he marched his army roughly 300 kilometers in about 4 days. An extraordinary effort. On the 25th of September 1066, Harold's army surprise attacked Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, east of York. Harold's forces were caught off guard. Many of his men had left their mail armor back at their ships because they expected to be collecting hostages and receiving supplies, not fighting a full-scale battle. When the English army appeared, the Norwegians had to rush to form a line. The battle that followed was brutal and close quarters. The exact tactical details are not fully recorded, and much of what we know comes from later narrative sources, rather than contemporary eyewitness accounts. What is clear from multiple traditions is this: the fighting lasted for hours. The Norwegians were gradually pushed back. At some point during the battle, Harald Hardrada was killed, likely by an arrow or spear to the neck. With Harald dead and many of his leading warriors fallen, the Norwegian line finally broke. Reinforcements who arrived later from the ships were also overwhelmed. The defeat was catastrophic. Of the large fleet that had come from Norway, only a small fraction of ships was needed to take the survivors home. Harald Hardrada was dead. His body was eventually returned to Norway and buried. Later tradition places his grave at Trondheim. 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson would himself die at the Battle of Hastings, fighting William of Normandy. The year 1066 would reshape the map of power in Northern Europe, and Harold's failed invasion was a key part of that story. Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge is often taken as a symbolic end to the Viking Age. He was a king who fought as a teenager at Stiklestad, served as a Varangian in Constantinople, ruled Norway with an iron hand, and died leading a massive invasion of England. Unlike many legendary Vikings, Harald Hardrada is not just saga myth. His life is anchored in multiple independent sources: Norse traditions, Rus and Byzantine records, and English chronicles. He was, in many ways, the last great pan-European Viking warrior, fighting from the Arctic north to the walls of Constantinople in the fields of Yorkshire. If you want more untold stories of real warriors and empires they tried to carve out, hit subscribe and dive into the next path of history.